I am pleased to have a chance to talk about blue carbon sequestration in the context of estuarine fish habitat restoration. And I will be using data from a bunch of different studies, and I will provide links to the papers in my last slide. And the PDFs of these talks will be up on the website as well as the recordings. So in the PDF, you can just click on those links and you won't have to worry about taking notes on any of these things. So let's advance. I want to talk about several topics, of course, fish habitat, carbon functions, and tidal wetland types, sediment accretion and carbon accumulation, climate change and sea level rise resilience, and then the estuarine landscape, a little bit about the West Coast versus the other parts of our country. Restoration practices, finally, that can enhance fish habitat, carbon functions, and sea level rise resilience. So I forgot to start my timer, and I'm going to do that right now. We asked the question, of course, what habitats do the best for fish? Is there a specific tidal wetland type that's best for fish? And in order to address that, I'm going to start with a little introduction to tidal wetland types. And these types are present across the entire West Coast. My photos will tend to have a Pacific Northwest focus since that's my region. And in the lower intertidal, you can see what Melissa was referring to, the seagrasses. Then we have the tidal marsh, low marsh and high marsh. And we also have in this upper intertidal, the shrub and forested tidal swamps. And they're very important as we move into this blue carbon discussion. So here's a diagram of where these different tidal wetland types occur across the elevation gradient in the estuary landscape. And this is somewhat specific to the Pacific Northwest, but we're working on these diagrams for other parts of the West Coast. So we're moving from a tidal water body here through the various tidal datums. Low marsh is found between mean tide level and mean higher high water approximately. High marsh is found between mean higher high and that annual high tide line that defines the boundary of the estuary. And both tidal swamp and high marsh occur in that last elevation category from mean higher high up to the boundary of the estuary. And the factor that distinguishes which is occurring in which location is salinity. So it's both a function of elevation and salinity, this distribution. And our tidal swamps, these shrub and forested tidal wetlands, are found in both brackish salinities and fresh salinities. So I wish I could get rid of that Zoom toolbar. Oh, I'll put it way over here. All right. So moving on to next topic. Oops, did I miss one? No. Okay, so Melanie Davis and Isa Wu and their colleagues created this nice conceptual chart showing the environments that fish experience as they move along this gradient in the Northwest. And it's sort of the opposite of what my slide was. It shows the river on the left and the ocean on the right. But they're quantifying conceptually several different functions and characteristics that affect fish habitat. And I know the text is too small to read here, so I'll tell you what some of these things are. On the left, functional characteristics. On the right, some of the drivers that form those characteristics. So for instance, salinity, low in the river systems, increasing as you move through the estuary, high in the ocean, factors affecting salinity, rainfall, snowmelt, tidal influence. An opposite shaped curve is prey energy density, which tends to be highest in the riverine forests and the upper intertidal, and then drops down lower as you approach offshore and ocean. And so in terms of predation, this line here, which is an opposite curve or similar to salinity, you have lowest predation in the tidal riverine forest. Again, this is all conceptual. And then as you move to the ocean, things get pretty hazardous for young fish with lots of predators. And these tidal forests that I've been talking about have some good protection from predators for young fish. Overhanging vegetation, deep, narrow tidal channels, low tide refugia, things like that. So the authors, though, conclude, given all these ranges of different functions across different habitat types, they conclude no single habitat provides maximal benefits. They did note, though, that the tidal forests provided higher quality food and higher modeled growth potential for young salmon compared to other estuary habitats. So that was an important point that they brought out. So Corey Green and his colleagues modeled juvenile Chinook salmon growth potential across marsh, shrub and forested tidal wetlands in the major deltas of Puget Sound in Washington state. And similar to what Melanie Davis and her colleagues concluded, Green et al. Concluded that there is no single best habitat type for juvenile salmon growth. Optimal growth potential varies across space and time, and therefore restoration planning should focus on habitat diversity as well as capacity to support these fish populations' recovery and resilience. And although I'm focusing on salmon here, many anadromous fish share these characteristics, and many other fish share the use of many different habitat types across time and cohorts. So it's important to recognize these habitat landscapes, the array of habitats. And that's what our restoration work tries to focus on, is bringing back at least a few examples of each of the elements of that landscape array of habitats. So what about blue carbon now? We've talked about fish. Is there a specific tidal wetland type that's best for carbon sequestration? Well, first, we argue that all tidal wetlands are blue carbon ecosystems. We feel it's really important to recognize the major carbon sequestration functions of the lesser known tidal wetlands. And those include these woody-dominated tidal swamps, both shrub swamps and forested tidal swamps that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So Chris is going to talk to you more about this West Coast blue carbon database, Chris Janasek. He led the development of this amazing resource. It's a compilation of over 1,200 soil cores from 69 different research projects on the West Coast, ranging from Alaska to Mexico. And the paper compares soil carbon among these 5 habitat types that are shown here: the mudflats, seagrass beds, emergent marsh, mangroves, and tidal swamp. Tidal swamps are mostly found in the Pacific Northwest, but there are some types of tidal swamps in California as well. So these graphs from the paper that Chris and all of us wrote up show how carbon content of soils varied between these 5 habitat types. And the y-axis shows carbon stocks, how much carbon is in the soil, and the x-axis breaks out these 5 habitat types. You can see that at all depths, the tidal swamp, that's this color, has the highest mean. It has variability, they all do. The letters at the top here represent significant differences. So seagrass beds in general were significantly lower than emergent marsh. Emergent marsh was significantly less than mangroves and tidal swamp. So the forested tidal wetlands alongside mangroves are very high performers for carbon storage. Most of these forested tidal swamps are in the Pacific Northwest, so I want to bring up this slide, which shows the carbon stocks from and above, both below and above ground, from cores we sampled in 28 different tidal wetlands across the Northwest. Each bar shows carbon stored in the soil. That's the gray, orange, and blue colors, and carbon stored in above ground parts like living trees or large woody debris lying on the ground surface. The forested tidal wetlands here are this group on the left. You can see that they have extraordinarily high soil carbon stocks. They also store a lot of carbon above ground, and Melissa mentioned that. That combination of very high carbon stocks and high above ground soil carbon and high above ground stocks elevates the total carbon storage for these forested tidal wetlands to double the average for tidal marsh. And of course, tidal marsh has long been recognized as pretty much a star performer in blue carbon ecosystems. Now, forested tidal wetlands stored 5 to 10 times more carbon than the seagrass beds, which are over here. Not to say, of course, as Melissa rightly pointed out, carbon storage isn't everything, but it is important to know these comparisons. So what about methane? You might be wondering about methane. Do forested tidal swamps produce methane? It's a potent greenhouse gas. It can be produced in wetlands. It can offset the carbon that's stored in the soil, reducing climate benefits. It's circled in this diagram here. So higher salinity tends to reduce methane emissions. As I mentioned before, shrub and forested tidal swamps are found in lower salinity areas, brackish to freshwater tidal zones. So it's a very legitimate question. We're just beginning to study methane release from Pacific Northwest tidal wetlands, including these tidal swamps. And our recent studies include this model from Williams et al. 2025, showing factors influencing methane emissions. And this was developed from field data from 26 tidal wetland sites in the Northwest. And as you can see, salinity is pretty high on the list of factors influencing methane emissions, but it's not the top factor. Elevation and water table level both were very important, and when you combine those two to think about soil hydrology, that outweighs salinity by quite a lot. And I have to say, these data are developed from least disturbed tidal wetlands, which can be quite different from restoration sites, but we're working on that too, and I'll show you the numbers there. So this table just shows our study sites and methane emissions, and the reference swamps had surprisingly low methane emissions, despite their low salinity, compared to restored marsh and wet pasture, which had higher levels. Unfortunately, I don't have really time to go into this, but I'm going to just draw a heart around tidal swamp because, well, it looks like maybe we have a winner for carbon functions, given the really high stocks and potentially small methane emissions. But there are some other factors that we should consider, and tidal marsh wants us to think about them. So thinking about how carbon benefits are measured, you can conserve existing wetlands. As Melissa mentioned, the benefits from that depend on the carbon stocks found in the soil of those wetlands. Or you could store new carbon. You could have a project that stores carbon in the soil, and that would be generally a tidal wetland restoration project. Now, I talked about how carbon stocks are highest in the high marsh and the tidal swamp, but rates of carbon storage are actually higher at low elevations. This graph is from a study by Katrina Poppy and John Rybzik. John will talk more about it in his talk, which is next. But basically, this x-axis represents their study sites arranged from low elevation at the left to high elevation at the right. And then the y-axis is the rate of carbon accumulation. And generally, as elevation goes up, carbon accumulation rates go down. And that's because lower elevation sites are inundated more often and they just get more sediment, and more sediment means more carbon accumulation. Now, I should go back for just a moment. So you notice that there's a ton of variability down here at the low elevations, though. Why do some sites have very high carbon accumulation rates and others have fairly low, even though they're both low elevation? Well, the red circled sites are restoration sites. They are not equilibrated with sea level. They're storing carbon like crazy because they're accumulating sediment like crazy due to accommodation space. So without getting into a ton of geomorphology, just know that low restoration sites can have very high accretion rates and very high carbon accumulation. So do we have a new winner? Low elevation marshes instead of high elevation swamps. They store a lot of carbon very fast. But there's a big caveat. What about climate change and sea level rise? We do have to think about potentially drowning of our tidal wetlands. Quickly showing a couple maps from Karen Thorne and Chris Janasek and their colleagues' study. They looked at the potential for tidal marsh to drown due to sea level rise. And they modeled this, and these maps show a scenario where sea level rise is about 2 feet by the year 2100. And this is one site, it's Bandon Marsh, a site I've worked on quite a bit. The colors show you that this site right now at the beginning of their study, 2010, was mostly what they called mid-marsh, which is in between low and high, and low marsh. But by 2110, most of that mid-marsh has transitioned to low, and quite a bit of the low marsh has drowned. It's turned into mudflat. Thorne's group modeled which factors affect survival versus drowning of tidal marsh, and the single most important factor at a given level of sea level rise was initial elevation. So the higher tidal wetlands have a better chance of surviving. That's what's called elevation capital. Elevation buffers a tidal marsh from sea level rise. So here's a graphic summary of what I've been talking about. These low marshes have higher carbon accumulation rates, but they also have lower sea level rise resilience. The high marsh and tidal swamp have higher carbon stocks and higher sea level rise resilience. So there are trade-offs here. The previous study of Karen Thorne's looked at survival of tidal marsh in its current location, but tidal wetlands can move landward when sea level rises. And in this image, you can see a cross-section of the estuary, again, with the current extent of tidal wetlands here, and then this future potential extent as sea level rises, and we call that the landward migration zone. And that's very important because as sea level rises, we need space for tidal wetlands to move up a slope. And in this picture, I'm showing a map from our 2017 report where Orange represents areas that are at the right elevation to be vegetated tidal marsh or tidal swamp. Blue is mudflat or open water. And as sea level rises towards 4.7 feet by the year, or we didn't specify the year, just a rise of 4.7 feet, the orange has expanded upslope, and much of the former orange tidal marsh has turned blue, it's drowned, and has become mudflat. So these kinds of maps help us figure out where we should look landward for future tidal wetlands. And this is part of what this means to restoration practitioners. We, based on everything I've talked about so far, we do need to make sure to protect current tidal wetlands. They are star performers, especially high marsh and tidal swamp. We need to protect and restore a full landscape array of habitats to support diverse carbon opportunities and wildlife resilience. And we need to look upslope to protect and restore landward migration zones. And last, we need to avoid single function prioritization. For instance, if you prioritize just those low elevation sites because you knew they would store a lot of carbon really fast, you might then lose them with sea level rise. So just touching a little more on accretion and carbon accumulation, these studies that I've listed here have shown for the Northwest, and this is true broadly, that carbon accumulation rates are strongly controlled by accretion rates. And a study that was led by Aaron Peck and Rob Wheatcroft that I also worked on, we took 72 cores from 7 Oregon estuaries, had a bunch of interesting findings related to sediment. We have very high sediment availability in the Pacific Northwest. Most sediment is carried offshore. Major river floods play a huge role in sediment accretion, very likely, and these factors increase sea level rise resilience. So here's a graph that shows some of the results from that study. The left side shows the estuaries that we studied up and down the Oregon coast from north to south. And the second graph shows what's called accretion balance. So the sediment accretion is shown as colored symbols here. And then the local sea level rise rate is shown, and that incorporates land motion, tectonic motion, other than giant earthquakes. That sea level rise rate is shown as a black box, and we want the colored symbol to be to the right of the black box, meaning sediment accretion is outpacing sea level rise. And that's true for most of these study sites, but not for 2 of the estuaries, interestingly. So it varies from site to site. But in general, it's we have lots of accretion, and that's supported by this trapping efficiency graph here. Aaron calculated how much of the sediment coming down these watersheds is trapped in the estuary versus how much goes out to the ocean. And generally, our estuaries in Oregon trap very low amount of the total sediment, less than 10%. And that's a good thing when it comes to thinking about climate change resilience, because we don't have a problem of sediment-starved systems. And that's not the case for other parts of the country. So Scott Ensign worked with Aaron Peck and Joanne Halls to model accretion balance on all continental U.S. coastlines. The blue watersheds are the ones where they estimated the accretion is greater than sea level rise, but the red areas have sea level rise greater than accretion. And the important point here is that the West Coast has a much more favorable accretion balance. That happens to be PMEP's geography, too. So there's also a big contrast between the east and west coasts in terms of tidal wetland losses. So in our 2024 paper, Andrus et al., we were able to quantify tidal marsh loss since the 1800s. And we couldn't do this for shrub and forested tidal wetlands because we just don't have the right kind of data. But for tidal marsh, the average loss across Washington, Oregon, and California was greater than 60% of tidal marsh. Other regions of the country had much lower levels of loss, much less loss, and even some slight gains in tidal marsh. So that's an important point because, again, PMEP's geography, right? High levels of tidal wetland loss. It's not a good thing, but it is an opportunity. And our 2019 paper showed this too, lumping together marsh and shrub and forested tidal wetlands. We've lost 85% of our tidal wetlands on the West Coast as a whole. So what does it mean to the restoration practitioner? Basically, prioritize watersheds that have intact natural processes, intact flood regimes. Examples of watersheds that don't have intact natural processes would be those that are dammed and are lacking sediment movement through the system. Work to remove off-site and basin-wide flow restrictions, such as dams or river mouth tide gates. Now, in funding applications, I recommend emphasizing the characteristics of our region, the abundant sediment supplies, the intact natural processes, and the high tidal wetland losses. All of those factors should raise the priority of West Coast restoration projects. At the site level, we can design restoration projects to enhance fish and carbon functions. And examples, well, first, the principle that we need to follow is to reestablish natural processes. Free flow of tides and sediment are vital. Upgraded tide gates might let some fish in, but they impede sediment accretion and other natural processes, so they reduce sea level rise resilience. And we need to incorporate design elements that slow flood flows and capture sediment. Some examples of those, which I will show pictures of, are tidal channel restoration, woody debris, topographic mounds, woody plantings, beaver. All of these have fish and carbon benefits, and all of them help improve sea level rise resilience. So some pretty pictures of these kinds of design elements that can be incorporated to enhance carbon sequestration and fish functions. Now, beaver really do enhance both fish and carbon functions. They were once abundant. They were nearly eradicated from our estuaries, but they're increasingly recognized as key to estuary health. These photos are of beaver dams in brackish tidal marsh, and beaver are very active in tidal swamps. So to wind up, what can a restoration practitioner do to benefit both fish and carbon functions? And my first recommendation is try to visualize an intact estuary landscape. What did your estuary look like before people made all the alterations that they've made? Then think about choosing sites across the full estuarine gradient of elevation and salinity. That will help support fish population resilience and allow diverse opportunities for both protecting existing carbon stocks and adding new carbon stocks. Protect again those existing tidal wetlands and incorporate design elements into restoration projects that capture sediment to benefit fish and carbon. And then when you're seeking funding, highlight the West Coast region's strengths, especially the intact natural processes. And then a little blurb for one of the next talks will be about monitoring. Very, very important, as Melissa mentioned. So these are links to the publications. You'll be able to click on those in the PDF. And I think now we have time for some discussion.
Thank you, Laura. As a reminder to everybody, if you've got questions for Laura, you're welcome to type them into the Q&A box. We do have one question for you currently from Catherine, and that is, can you recommend a good model to use when representing landward migration and sea level rise?
It's an excellent point. There are a number of models out there. We used a very simple bathtub model informed by our field knowledge of the elevations at which vegetated tidal wetlands occur. So and a bathtub model has its limitations. It simply looks at where the water goes and where these vegetated tidal wetlands exist. It actually performed really well, even when compared to much more complex models. We looked at our results, and I would recommend you look at our paper, and it lined out quite closely to more complex models like the Warmer model or the SLAM model. I basically would recommend use your local data in terms of the elevations where certain habitats exist, elevations and salinities, and then the bathtub model will get you a good distance of the way there to understanding the future.
Thank you, Laura. Two more questions. What is your take on thin layer placement in terms of jump-starting carbon sequestration restoration?
Yeah, it can be very expensive per acre. My recommendation usually is to find sites that are in a position to receive sediment and build up naturally. I know there are some places where that's not a great option because sediment is not available. And maybe there's a ton of dredged material that needs to be disposed of, and so thin layer placement could be appropriate in such areas. But the return on the dollar invested is often way, way, way higher if you can remove a barrier to natural sediment deposition and let nature take care of it. I also feel that engineered solutions in the long run don't have the resilience that we need. Natural processes will continue to work even after we, for some reason, stop monitoring or caring for a site. Nature will continue to keep it resilient.
Thank you, Laura. All right, one more question as of now. We do have time for a few more, so if you've got questions for Laura, feel free to put them in the Q&A. You mentioned tide gates and their impact on tidal habitats. How can we improve the design of tide gates to allow more functional tidal habitats and still allow and still serve to regulate tidal flow?
There are definitely situations where improved tide gates are appropriate if there's no chance of fully restoring a site. Allowing back the natural flooding regime and the natural sediment deposition regime, a better fish-friendly tide gate could be a reasonable solution. The problem is they stop tides, generally, even the best of fish-friendly tide gates, like muted tide regulators. They stop tides at a certain height, and so sometimes the highest tides that tend to bring the most sediment are being blocked. Now you can get overdike flows in some areas, despite the presence of tide gates that do bring in sediment, but basically I think tide gates have been shown also in some very large and very rigorous studies, fish-friendly tide gates as a restoration mechanism or not. They are the one type of restoration that doesn't have good measurable long-term results. So as a solution in places where you don't have other options, yes, there's a place for them. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Laura, I've also made it so that if people do have continual pending questions, you're able to type answers to them. And that goes for all of our speakers as well. You can go through and type answers after your talk is done. We do have just a few more questions that came in through the Q&A. Question from Dominic. Do you know of any monitoring or restoration that looks at the seaward marsh migration zone? By adding more enclosing barriers around an estuary retaining sediment or removing a key stressor, such as introduced Canadian geese in the Canadian Salish Sea that degrade low mid-quality marsh and prevent marsh expansion?
That's a really interesting question. I would not so much consider that seaward marsh migration as just a natural progradation of a marsh, and we want that to occur where it can. Some of those factors like Canada geese I've heard of, and I'm not really sure how people are approaching trying to keep geese from eating this recently accreted tidal marsh down to the nubbins and causing it to revert back to mudflat. It's a challenge for sure. Maybe there are other habitats that have become less available to Canada geese, so they're all going to the marsh. I really don't know. That I think you've got the right idea that we want marsh to be able to expand where it can. I don't know about enclosing barriers around an estuary. To me, that sounds a little like one of those engineered solutions that might have some problems in terms of long-term maintenance, but it's an interesting idea. Barriers around an estuary to retain sediment. What I've heard more rather than flow barriers per se is installation of topographic features that can help capture sediment. Things like linear mounds that can help establish woody vegetation that will then die and fall and put large woody debris in place that will capture sediment or that will improve vegetation establishment. And the veg is really good at capturing sediment. So yeah, the idea is good. I don't know about a barrier approach to that.